Episode 90 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew Sykes, and it's been a while. I think the last one was published back in April, shortly after I'd been to the Yorkshire Dales. So it is a few months since the last episode of the podcast. But don't read into that any lack of enthusiasm for producing these podcasts. I still enjoy doing it, and they will continue. Hopefully a few more coming up over the summer of 2025. I've already recorded the next podcast, or potentially the next podcast. It might not end up being the next podcast, but it will appear at some point. And I'm off to France again during the summer, so there'll be no doubt a podcast about that, and no doubt other things as well. But anyway, that's all in the future. In this podcast, we're going to be hearing from two people. We've got a monologue from an Australian called Gayle Moore. But first, we're going to hear from the journalist Steve Silk. He appeared on the podcast quite a while ago talking about his first book, and he's got another book coming out very, very soon. So without further ado, started by asking him to reintroduce himself.
Hello, my name is Steve Silk, and I'm the author of Go West, which will be published on July the 10th. And it sees me on a bike heading from London to the Welsh coast over 8 glorious days on a bike with a little bit of canoeing in the middle there as well.
Right. Before we get to that, we're going to have to fill in the details since I last spoke to you now, because your first book, which was called The Great North Road, I spoke to you on episode 34 of this podcast, which was way back in May of 2021. Now, that first book saw you cycle roughly the line of the A1, the Great North Road, and you subsequently wrote the book about it. Can you talk through what led you to write a second book, or rather the journey itself? What inspired you after having cycled the A1, the Great North Road? How did you come up with the idea for a second book, and why did you choose this particular route?
Well, first of all, actually, whether it was going to be a book or not, I simply enjoyed myself so much on the bike in the first trip, the Great North Road trip, that I'd already got the bug, really. I was pretty addicted to it. So it was a case of looking around the country and trying to work out what might be a good follow-up. Nothing can compare to the Great North Road in terms of the history of that road itself. It stands alone as the preeminent British highway. But in terms of where I could enjoy myself, where was a challenge, where offered variety and contrasts, I did have a good, long, hard look at the other major roads heading out of London before I came to my decision. I mean, you might have thought, for example, that it would have been one of the A1, A2, A3, A4, A5, A6, the 6 principal ones that radiate from London. But none of those quite appealed, and it was quite by accident that I hit upon the idea of the A40. I don't know about you, Andrew, but I'm one of those people who reads a map like I read a book, and I was idly hanging around, I think, in my car waiting for my wife to do something, pulled open the road atlas and was just reading stuff. That's how much of a map nerd I am. And I'd never really paid much attention to the A40 before, except in knowing that it was the road that took me from London to Oxford and a bit beyond. But I really hadn't worked out quite how extensive that road was, and the fact that it goes through some absolutely classic English and then Welsh countryside. So you've got the Chilterns, you've got the Cotswolds, you've got Banau Brycheiniog, the Brecon Beacons, as we now call it, and you've got the Wye Valley in between, and the Welsh coast as well. So there was really quite a lot of parts of England and Wales that I'm not overly familiar with, but I really thought would be fascinating. And I do think, as a cycling adventure, this one has the edge over the Great North Road in terms of that contrast, as I say.
We're assuming a lot of knowledge here, actually. I forgot to say at the beginning, you introduced yourself, but do you continue to be a regular cyclist, a travelling cyclist, a touring cyclist?
Yes, I do. I cycle at least once a week, every week. And that is a group of us lads heading out from Church Plain in Loddon, the very small Norfolk market town where I live, and we head out and we do 20 miles every weekend. And I think we would all agree that keeps us sane. But over and above that, we like an odd long weekend jolly or a longer trip like this from time to time. And we really feel that that keeps us on our toes. If we've got something in the summer to aim for, like a Go West or an equivalent, I don't write books about all of them. If we've got something like that that we can focus on, it gets us out of bed on those really grim December and January Saturday mornings, and it makes us do 30 miles, 40 miles on a Saturday, whereas otherwise we're lazy blokes in our mid-50s. We just tend to go to the nearest cafe, have a good chat, and then wander back again. So there's that sense of focus that we have and the sense of enjoyment on the road. But yes, I am a cyclist. I don't cycle to work very often. I'm not cycling every day. But yes, I've got 2 bikes in the garage and they're both regularly used.
But you're not a cycle camper, are you? You're no fan of camping?
No, I'm quite virulently anti that, which of course is not what you want to hear, Andrew. I'm a so-called credit card tourer, and that's certainly what I did on this journey. I stay in a mixture of cheap hotels, Airbnbs, coaching inns if I feel like I'm splashing out, and I love that. And I love to do 40 or 50 miles a day and then have a very, very comfortable night's sleep rather than somehow carrying the tent with me and somehow putting it up and cooking my dinner on a stove. I'm down the nearest restaurant. Unlike you, I mean, hats off to you guys. You're hardcore. I'm happy to live with that title of the credit card tourer that I think some people think is a bit of an insult. I wear it as a badge of honour.
No, I think it's a wide spectrum, isn't it, of people who go cycle touring. And I think increasingly it is more and more people who do it as you're doing it. It's very easy nowadays to, whip out your phone and get on booking.com and find accommodation if you haven't planned it in advance. If you think back to, I don't know, certainly pre-internet days, 30, 40 years ago, it was actually, if you wanted just to head off on your bike somewhere without a fixed plan, camping was probably not just a cheap option, but it was also a practical option because you could just rock up at a campsite and pitch your tent and stay there, similarly with the youth hostels. Whereas now, it's possible just to do that, and I've done it myself, because when I go and visit a big city, I'll usually either stay in a hotel or perhaps warm shower, something like that. And that's simply because I can whip out the phone, go on to booking.com, find a cheap hotel and book myself in and be, at their door within a few minutes. So I think it's, I would say cycle camping is still alive and strong, thank goodness. But there are so many ways to do it nowadays, which are equally practical.
Yeah. I start off my book, my preface, fast forward the reader to the end of my day 3 when I pitch up at the New Inn in Gloucester, which is a really classic old coaching inn dating back to medieval times. And I asked to put my bike somewhere safe, and they take me to a function room and the doors get open and there are a dozen other bikes in there already. And I just think, right, I'm in good hands here. But also it just makes you think there's a few quid in it for hotels. If they look after you and all they need, these big hotels have space, don't they? All they need to do is just somewhere where you can lock it up safely for the night. And you've got us. And once the word presumably gets round, everyone will say, oh, yeah, they look after you and they're all right. I'm sure they do really good business from that perspective. I never felt my bike was ever unsafe or was in danger of being lost or anything. Everyone was really, really accommodating to us as cyclists, which is how it should be. But I guess I don't always take it for granted. But on this trip, we were looked after royally.
Back to the A40. I'll be honest, I've heard of the M40. I've probably driven on the M40. In fact, I've definitely driven down it when I used to live down in Berkshire. Presumably the A40 was the forerunner of the M40. Why did they call it the A40? Why didn't they call it the, well, whatever number came next? Why did they call it the A40 rather than, obviously the A4 exists, the A5 exists? Is it halfway between the two?
Well, as I understand it from the classification of roads, they decided on their big six, with A7, 8 and 9, of course, being in Scotland, and then they just filled in with the, as they saw it, the less major roads in between.
When did they actually decide the numbers? Because originally, a bit like the Great North Road wasn't the A1, it was the Great North Road. And you were following in the footsteps, or the cycle path even, of a chap called Charles Harper. So what was he following? He wasn't presumably following the A40 because it didn't exist.
No, indeed. So the classification of the roads came in over the course of a few years in the early 1920s. And I used 1921 as the 100th anniversary. If I'm being honest, you could pick 2 or 3 years within that period, but I used 1921 as the 100th anniversary of, in effect, the abolition of the Great North Road to go for that one. So yes, you're quite right that when my cycling muse, Charles G. Harper, was travelling at the end of the 19th century and in the early years of the 20th century, he just called them, what he called this road, the London, Gloucester and Milford Haven Road. And that was simply what his book in 2 volumes was called. He has other books called, the Bath Road. We're more familiar with the Portsmouth Road. He just simply named them by their final destination. It's slightly more complicated. Forgive me for being nerdy when it comes to the A40, because the A40 used to go to Milford Haven, which was the primary port for disembarkation to Ireland in the old days. There's been quite a lot of different attempts at different ports along that bit of the South Wales coast, and Fishguard became the major port sometime later. So the A40 shifted its focus for the last 15 miles or so. Rather than going, let me get this right, rather than going south, it now goes north from Haverfordwest up to the port of Fishguard.
Yeah, it does indeed. I'm just looking at it. It's I always find it fascinating looking at maps, because I've never in my life looked at Haverfordwest or where Milford Haven and Fishguard are in relation to each other. But yeah, it's fascinating to see what happens there.
Well, and more intricate than that, actually, whilst I followed the route of the A40, we, all the way as far as Carmarthen, I then took the view that from Carmarthen onwards, so that is due west to Haverfordwest and then north, there just weren't the alternatives. There weren't the safe alternatives that I could rely on without really going uphill and down dale. Most of the rest of the journey, I was able to be within 2 or 3 miles of the A40, but on somewhere safe. Occasionally I was on the single track, not single track, but non-dual carriageway A40. But for most of the time, I was able to stay very close to it. That becomes more and more difficult the further west you got. And I, particularly with the responsibility of having my 3 mates with me, I didn't want us to do anything that was remotely unsafe. So from Carmarthen, we took the hypotenuse across to Fishguard. There is a very good reason that the main road does not take the hypotenuse. It is seriously up and down, with the emphasis on the up. And we did thousands of feet of ascent on that day, and we had the aching muscles to prove it. 4,635 feet of ascent, to be precise. I've just looked it up in the book.
Tell me more about this Charles Harper chap. How did you come across him, and was he the kind of Bill Bryson of his day?
I wouldn't describe him as the Bill Bryson in that there isn't really the humour there, but he was indefatigable in exploring the major routes out of London. And in his eyes, he was almost writing these roads obituaries, because he was writing at a time when rail was king. Stagecoaches, mail coaches had disappeared just about within living memory for his older audience. So he was in elegiac mode, saying, look at these wonderful old roads, look at these coaching inns that are being closed down. Roads don't need to be as wide anymore. Isn't it sad? But isn't there so much majesty in these old stories that are fast disappearing? I've managed to speak to the last fellow who saw da-da-da-da. So that's what he was doing. And I think I'm right in saying there are 19 volumes of books covering 13 roads. As he saw it, the 13 major roads out of London, everything from Hastings to Penzance to Edinburgh and Milford Haven to Manchester, Glasgow. The reason that there are 19 volumes is that the longer roads took 2 volumes. So, for example, the Great North Road, and indeed my latest one, Take a Break Halfway. The Great North Road, Volume 1 finishes at York, and for the books that I had in my pannier this time round, Volume 1 finishes at Gloucester, and then he goes Gloucester deep into Wales for Volume 2.
He was writing his books in the first 10, 15, 20 years of the 20th century, yeah?
Started in the 1890s. I would say his heyday was the 1890s through to the outbreak of the First World War. There are several that were republished in the 20s, but they were mainly in a way that we couldn't conceive of now. They were republished pretty much unchanged 20 years on. Can you imagine us doing that now? So yes, his heyday was late Victorian and then the Edwardian era. The other, he's not always PC, to say the least. I kind of choose to ignore that, but it probably should be acknowledged. And he gets grumpier the further away from London he gets. He can be quite scathing about everything and everyone he sees in Wales, for example.
I'm assuming he wasn't camping.
No, but he doesn't spell it out as such. Again, it's not quite like the books that I write in, that he's not explicitly on a bike. You just have to pick it up from time to time, the odd mention of the fact that he clearly fell off here, or this steep hill down there should definitely have better warning signs on it. He's not explicit about it. I suspect that was just a sort of a trick of the time. That was the acceptable way of writing in his era, whereas we're sort of slightly more confessional these days, aren't we?
And how did you first come across him?
If you go anywhere near the Great North Road, you just pick him up. You know that there have been many books written about the Great North Road, and he is the sort of founding father of us all. And from there, I've now grown to have quite a few of his other books. They cost, I don't know, they cost about sort of 15, 20, 25 quid or so to get secondhand. They're quite rare and getting rarer, but they are there to be found in secondhand bookshops. Normally, the second editions, which, as I say, were published in the 1920s rather than the ones that were at the turn of the century.
Now, your journey back to the A40, back to the London to the Welsh coast, 8 days, 2 wheels and a whole lot of hills. That's the subtitle on the front. 8 days. Now, I've been lucky enough to, when I've done my big cycles, they've lasted 6 weeks, 2 months, 3 months, the biggest. And basically, it's relatively easy to find something to write about, because you can ignore basically all the hours of time and a few days where nothing really remotely interesting happens, and you can skim over it because you think, well, you know, something did interesting happen the following day. But that's quite a limited amount of time to write a book, I would have thought. I've never done it myself. You must have packed in quite a lot of stopping, staring, investigating, you know, reading plaques, reading information boards, going into cathedrals, all that kind of touristy stuff, as well as the cycling itself. Was that quite a challenge?
Yes, it is quite a challenge. And you're right, each day was very full, but it was backed up by some research days beforehand and some subsequent research days afterwards, so that if I felt like I hadn't quite nailed it about some aspect of Gloucester Cathedral, I could go back and just check my facts without getting in the way of the chronology or the narrative flow. So yes, I don't think I could write a book based purely on everything I saw and did within those 8 days. There needs to be some setup and some retrofitting as well. But on the other hand, I wouldn't want to write a book like this where I hadn't genuinely ridden each day consecutively. This book starts at St Paul's Cathedral, finishes at Lower Town in Fishguard 8 days later, and you've got to have that sense, haven't you? I think you would be deceiving the viewer if, for example, you'd taken a break after day 3 or something. This is very much 8 consecutive days on the road with some research thrown in afterwards, just to make sure I'm checking my facts, getting everything straight.
And when you set off from St Paul's Cathedral, after having failed to find a sign which says this is the start of the A40, and I do like the comparison you make with Paris, because all the roads in France basically start outside the door of Notre Dame in that square, whereas typically British.
Yep, and typically French.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. It's a nice kind of sums up the two nationalities perfectly and their attitudes to organisation. Did you know exactly what, apart from obviously not knowing where you were going to start from exactly, but did you know the route that you were going to follow? And also, did you know all the things that you were going to visit along the way? Or did you get somewhere and, oh, that looks remotely interesting, stop, investigate, and then carry on half an hour later?
You hope for serendipity along the way, but you plan in case you don't get that. But for example, I get to a churchyard in the Cotswolds, and it's sort of almost the first village in the Cotswolds that I've come to. Opinions vary on the borders of the Cotswolds. And there's a guy there who is a London cabbie and is just mooching about. And I say, what are you doing here then with a plate that says East Ham or whatever? And he's conducting he's got a tourists from America who are there because they love Downton Abbey and they've got a specific tour guide with them, and you just end up chatting to them and you find yourself in this absolutely picture perfect churchyard with a house where the Mitford sisters grew up just across there, and a particular kind of tombstone that's unique just to the Windrush Valley here. And suddenly you're seeing it through the eyes of Jeff from North Carolina, and you're seeing it in stereo, so to speak, to mix my metaphors, just because you can suddenly appreciate it in a different way. So that's what you hope for. And I think if you go into these journeys with a smile on your face and looking to chat to people, you're much more likely to find those bits of good luck along the way. There were a couple back in the New Inn in Gloucester who are still cycling in their 80s with a group of their friends. They're my absolute inspiration now. Tony's in his 80s and he's still knocking out 30 or 40 miles a day at that age. I mean, just extraordinary stuff.
And when you meet these people, do you actually tell them that you're writing a book? So does Tony, this guy in his 80s, does he know that he's appeared in the book?
He does. He was actually quite difficult to track down afterwards, because I think if you're naming someone, you should either be upfront about it at the time, or maybe you don't realise at the time that you're going to want to include it, so you have to track them down. So that's what I do. I don't make up anyone's names. I know some people do that. I either keep it anonymous or I'm explicit and I go back to people and say, look, send him an email. Here's what I'm planning. No one, by the way, has ever said no. Having said that, Jeff from North Carolina doesn't know, actually, but he's only Jeff. If I get sued by Jeff from North Carolina, I'm in trouble now, aren't I?
Yeah. Again, I'm reflecting here on my own experiences of having, travelled with a bike and then written something about it. I have to, hand on heart, I have to say that in the books, I don't think I'm cheating here, but I do present the information in the book as if almost I learned it as I was travelling. And honestly, a lot of it, probably the majority, is research once I got home, because I either didn't have the time available or the inclination or the resources to actually go and find out about that particular building in that particular place or the history of that particular canal or whatever. I can't think of an alternative way of doing it, but I do present it as if I'm kind of this all-knowing person who is brilliant at research when he's traveling by bike. Are you similar, or do you have a different approach?
I've never quite gone under the bonnet in this way before, but I think how I would explain it is I have two slightly different voices when I'm writing. So the first one is me actually describing what I'm doing, but then I can fall back on a little bit of history, uh, a little bit of geography that isn't me in the moment. It's slightly more reflective, and it's in slightly teacher mode. I hope it doesn't come across like that, but you know what I mean. And I think if you're in teacher mode, you can say stuff that you haven't necessarily found out there and then. Whereas if I'm in the cathedral and I've just come down these steps next to the sepulchre to Edward II, then that did genuinely happen.
Yeah, it is interesting talking to somebody who's kind of gone through a similar process. There was once a withering review for one of my books, and it really infuriated me. I've learned to kind of cope with bad reviews, who cares? But this particular person said, "Oh, it's all copied from Wikipedia," and I was so miffed with that because I thought, no, it hasn't. It is so difficult when you're writing a book and researching after or even before to avoid Wikipedia, but I did avoid it. I did not click on those links. I did not read Wikipedia pages for the information. The one thing I occasionally did was to go to the references at the bottom of each Wikipedia page, and that was a good source of other original information. And I thought that those were good places to research. But no, it's whoever it was who wrote me that review. I haven't forgiven him because I vehemently do not copy stuff from Wikipedia, but he clearly thought I did.
I think it's a bit of a lazy criticism that you could label anyone who includes any information in any book. I've had one or two of those as well. I'm not going to worry about it. I'm just not going to worry about it.
Right, let's get back to the route. So you set off from St Paul's Cathedral, and your first destination is High Wycombe?
Yep.
So you've got 8 days. Did you know exactly where you were going to stay for the 8 days between London and Fishguard?
Yes, I did on this occasion. I do agree with you, Andrew, that sometimes it's nice to leave it open. But on this occasion, I was on a timetable to meet with my 3 mates in Monmouth on a particular day. So it seemed to be sensible to space out the nights in between, which were High Wycombe, Ensham and Gloucester, to get me to Monmouth in good time. So on this occasion, all of my accommodation was sorted out in advance. So there wasn't that element of serendipity, which, as I say, I do like normally, but I was really keen to structure it so that I was, not least, for example, I was actually changing bikes at Monmouth. My mates had brought me down a mountain bike and we were switching there. So yes, this was all quite carefully choreographed on this occasion. But there's still plenty of time for going off the beaten track between your destination on day 1 to 2 to 3 to 4.
In fact, you mentioned the bike. Tell us about the bike or the bikes. What were you cycling?
I cycled on my old Jamis Aurora, which is a tourer, which I've had for getting on for 10 years now, with a single pannier on the near side, carrying very limited clothes, Charles Harper's books, and some maps, and that was it. I had very few clothes off the bike to keep the weight down, but I did arrange things though that I could leave a package in Monmouth and pick it up on the way back, and then have new stuff that my mates had brought down with me. In fact, I even, because I left a car at Fishguard way before I even took the bike down there, I was able to drop off small parcels at each of my locations in Wales, so that I was only carrying, let's say 2 shirts, 2 socks, whatever, in between times. So I'm a real one for traveling light, and organisation did me proud there. Then, of course, you've got to remember to pick them up again on the way back. But that all worked really well. And again, all of the hotels loved it. Actually, they didn't think it was bizarre. They just got it. They said, "Yeah, of course we can. Yeah, we'll leave it down here. That's where it'll be, down there, mate. No problem." So that worked really well.
That's almost like Scott of the Antarctic, when they drop stuff in the snow, and then they use it when they're coming back from wherever they've been to.
Oh yeah, okay. I'll happily take that comparison. Not quite so intrepid.
Back to Steve in a few minutes, but now we're going to hear from a cyclist called Gayle Moore from Australia, and she is talking about cycling from coast to coast.
Hi, my name's Gayle Moore and I'm an Australian. You might be able to tell from my accent that I grew up in South Africa. So my husband Ethel and myself have reached a point in life where we have got adult children and we really wanted a big life adventure. We are both adventure seekers. I tend to enjoy hiking, multi-day hikes, and Ethel is a cyclist, as well as working in the area of cycling and alternative transport. So we've been planning for a few years, knowing that we wanted an experience that we could remember forever. And we decided that we would cycle across Europe, starting in Donegal and going all the way east to Istanbul. We've been researching the Eurovelo routes, and we realized that it would be a great practice to see if we would actually enjoy doing this by doing another multi-day cycle route. So we've practiced in South Korea with the Four Rivers Cycle Trail, about 800 kilometers, and that was with camping the whole way. We've decided to start our Donegal trip with some accommodation instead of camping, because being Australian, we're not so used to this thing that you guys call rain, and we weren't sure what it would be like in April. So although most of our ongoing travel is with camping, our Irish part of the holiday has been staying in hostels. So we did the coast to coast to coast to coast. And in doing that, we went from Dublin to Donegal, 320 kilometres. Then from Donegal across to Belfast via the Giant's Causeway, 267 kilometres. And then we went from Kenrine in Scotland across to Tynemouth on the east coast, along Hadrian's Wall for the second part of that. And that was 385 kilometres. We did all of our planning by looking on the app cycle.travel, which has been great. And we've also been listening to a lot of the Empires podcast, which is set in the UK, as part of our preparation, and also to enjoy listening while we've been cycling. So we started on the 6th of April from Dublin, and the start of it was going via the Royal Canal, or the Grand Canal first, and then the Royal Canal. Now, the Royal Canal, as you may know, is part of the Famine Way, which is around 167 kilometres, all the way to a place called Longford, and it commemorates that terrible Irish famine in the 1800s. It is a beautiful place for cycling, and we made good time on that section, which wasn't always the case, because we realised soon after that there are a lot more hills in Ireland than we maybe expected. We deviated from the normal routes to go and look at our family routes out in Arval, which is where the three provinces of Ulster, Leinster and Connaught meet up. And an absolutely beautiful part of the cycle, but as I said, lots of hills. From there we did 100 k's across to Donegal. We joined up with the Eurovelo 1 when we got to the coast, but we didn't tend to stick with it because it had greater distances to it, and we wanted to get to places a little bit quicker. So beautiful scenery, but again, lots of hills, lovely low stone walls, which we enjoyed, and the sheep farms. We had to work pretty hard to find the Atlantic Ocean, though. When we were in Donegal, we discovered the morning that we were leaving Donegal that it was low tide, and we're not used to that from Australia, so we had to walk out a little bit to find a few puddles of water to touch to officially start the second part of the coast to coast. So our next destination was Derry, and that was an incredible place to go for the history and for understanding more of what's been happening in that country. So we went straight across via Ballybofey on that section because, again, the coastal route would have taken too long. So we went on the Eurovelo there. After this, we went the Giant's Causeway scenic coastal route to Bushmills. It was absolutely beautiful arriving there in time for sunset. We camped nearby and had a lovely sunset at the Giant's Causeway. We got some good advice from a local on the way who told us both that King Charles had visited the bakery that we were just about to go into, and we really did approve of what we bought there. And he also told us to stick to the coastal route on the way to Giant's Causeway, and it was incredible with all of the scenery and the Dunluce Castle along the way. So just a hint here, don't try to get there too quickly, enjoy the coastal route when you can. Our final day of cycling in Ireland took us from Bushmills, the Giant's Causeway, about 90 kilometres via the A2, mostly on the coastal route, with amazing downhills along the Antrim coast, seeing those beautiful glens and lovely topography. Well, we were pretty chilly because the hills were fairly long and made for some cold temperatures, but we saw most of the Irish people were swimming at the beach when we went past, so pretty impressed with the resilience of everyone. And we've had beautiful weather the whole way through. We've been very lucky. We even got sunburnt in Ireland, which most of our Australian friends didn't think was possible. So after we arrived in Larne, we took a couple of days off to go visit friends in Belfast. And then we caught the ferry across to Cairnryan, arriving around 6 o'clock in the evening. And we had to race the rain because this was now the day of the rain. When we were looking for our wild camp, we found a beautiful wild camping place at Torswarren National Park on the Galloway coast. This is also part of our plan on this travel experience, is to do some wild camping along the way where we're allowed to. Route 7 is the route that we took across to Newton Stewart and via Dumfries. At Newton Stewart is where the EV1, the Atlantic route, deviates off the route that we were going. So we just followed Route 7, and it was wild and lovely, beautiful, but cold and rainy cycling through there. From there we went to Gretna Green and to Carlisle. We took a few days off to go hiking in the Lake District, and then we returned by train to Carlisle to continue our cycle route across to the east coast. So the Hadrian's Wall, Sustrans 72, is how we made it across to Newcastle. The first 33 kilometres to Banks didn't show us much of the wall, but our second day of 60 kilometres to Hexham was really excellent. We recommend going off the Sustrans 72 route to visit the beautiful sites at Walltown Crags, and again, a bit later on, to see the Hastings Fort. But be aware that there's a very busy road to get there. So the last day of 70 kilometres took us from Hexham across to Roman Arbea Fort in South Shields. We caught a ferry at the end there. And it was a bit easier to touch the North Sea than it had been to touch the other oceans, as it was high tide at the time on that beautiful beach there. So we've had an amazing time so far on our journey. Currently we're sitting in a campsite in Versailles and having just finished the Avenue Verte route from London to Paris. We're going to continue from here to the Loire Valley, and then we have a few different options, but mostly following Eurovelo routes all the way to Istanbul. If you're wanting any more details from me, we are blogging weekly on our website, which is tallmoors.wordpress.com, or you can reach me at tallmoors@smallbones.com. Thanks for listening. Bye.
Thank you, Gail. Kind of almost live from France. It did sound live, all those birds in the background from that French campsite. So there we go, coast to coast and coast to coast. She mentioned Vindolanda there, and I'm just looking on Google Maps because I stayed at a great campsite called Windshields, and it looks as though it's still open, just next to that busy road that you've got to travel along, not far from where the Sycamore Gap tree used to be. Sounds like a good adventure. And you don't have to be in your 20s and 30s, by the sounds of it, to go wild camping, even though it's not something that I've ever really embraced. Anyway, thank you, Gail. If you want to contribute your own podcast, all the contact details at cyclingeurope.org/contact. Right, back to Steve Silk, and I asked him about his bicycles. I've never heard of a Jamis Aurora before, but I've just looked it up, and they still make them by the looks of it. Oh, hang on, that's 2011. Do they still make Jamis Auroras?
To my knowledge, yeah, but I haven't looked recently. Mine was a 2016 model.
Right, okay. And are they British?
No, they're American.
Ah.
But I was a bit worried about that, so I make sure I got it in British racing green, and then swapped the American saddle for a Brooks one. So I was sort of masquerading as a British bike, so to speak.
The images of them on the internet here that I'm looking at, they do it looks like a traditional touring bike.
Yes, that's exactly the look I was after, frankly. I mean, one, it's practical. It really is practical. It's got spokes, spare spokes stuck to the side of it as well. And I thought it was a Charles Harper type bike. So I was sort of going out of my way to be slightly old-fashioned and twee in the look of the bike, as well as in following his words on the page.
But you just had the one pannier. You were travelling, as you, I think, make it very clear in the book, because you were in the hotels. You refer to yourself as a credit card cyclist. Can you explain that?
Yeah, a credit card tourer is simply someone who wants a decent night's sleep, is how I would argue. I'm perfectly up for camping in other circumstances, but yeah, I'm just up for getting to the end of the day, having a nice meal, chucking the bike somewhere safe, and retiring to a hotel bed.
But I think it means something more than that, doesn't it? It's not just the camping thing. It's the fact that you really are choosing, for good reasons, to travel with as few things as possible. I mean, some people do take it to the extreme, and they don't take anything apart from their credit card and the very, very essential things like, a sawn-off toothbrush. Those Audax riders who travel hundreds and hundreds of miles, and they just really want to travel with nothing apart from their credit card, and then basically anything they pay for on their card. At least you had one pannier.
I had one pannier. I did get it a bit wrong to start with, and I only realised as I was starting day one that this one pannier was very, very full. So in High Wycombe Post Office, got a call at 9 o'clock on the morning of day two, and I posted off bits and pieces back home. And also in Ensham, I still wasn't happy. So another sort of £3.70 or something, saw another parcel go back home. And of course, maps wise, you can shed as you go as well. I do like having an ordnance survey for just about every bit that I'm traveling on. So yeah, by the time I'd got to, I guess let's say the Cotswolds, I was happy with what I was taking. I then switched at Monmouth to a mountain bike, and I've got a Voodoo Bizango, which is a mid-range, quite well-reviewed mountain bike of, I think I've had it 3 or 4 years, and that isn't really designed to have a pannier on the back wheel. So I had a much more a smaller top peak, effectively a saddlebag that just stuck out the back of the saddle, but weirdly defies gravity and sort of goes up as long as you have the straps right. And I had even less in that, but that did me quite well. I was quite impressed with how that coped with the quite rough terrain that we were seeking out once we'd crossed into Wales.
I'm going to go back to the Jamis Aurora, because people listening to this will be doing like what I'm doing and thinking, what did he send back? What were those objects that you set off with from St Paul's Cathedral that you then posted back home?
There's the socks, there's the pants, there's the T-shirt. One, right? If you've got 4 of those for your first 4 days until you restock, they can all go day by day, and at least 1 ordnance survey, if not 2 per day, because I tend to have the orange Explorer ones rather than the pink what are they called? Land Ranger ones. And I think I'd also stupidly had a couple of smaller reference books that I thought I might read. And you never read anything when you're actually on the road. Who was I kidding? You're always too in the moment and you're writing. That's what I do. I've got my notebook and I'm scribbling away. Anything else can wait till the end. So yes, it was just those boring, mundane things that can once they've done their job on day one, day two, off they go.
Did you take Charles Harper's books with you?
I did, and they are heavy. But I only had to take the one at a time because I could switch. But yeah, no, that was the biggest extravagance really. But it felt wrong not to have had them with me.
Right, let's talk about the details of the route. It might be worth splitting up your journey into the two bike sections. So the first bit basically in England on the touring bike, and the second bit on the mountain bike in Wales. What were the highlights of the English section?
Cotswolds, undoubtedly, day 3 was the best within England. Charles Harper didn't find this route. He stuck to the main road, unsurprisingly, because he didn't have HGVs going past him. But there is a very lovely side road between the A40 on the ridge of the hill and the river Windrush in the valley. And this route just pootles along through. I know there's many different kinds of classic English countryside, but this is almost the one that, perhaps the Americans would think of as being quintessentially English. And I just had a lovely time. It was a sunny day. You've got all that gorgeous Cotswold stone. It was quite hard work. I think I did 50 miles that day. I felt it. You go through these lovely villages. Burford, as a market town in that part of the world, is absolutely jam-packed, full of history around every corner. You certainly feel as if you've left London and the southeast behind. The pace of life slows a little bit. I enjoyed finding, if not a source of the River Thames called Seven Springs, just on the outskirts towards Gloucester, towards the end of that day. And then there's a really steep hill called Birdlip Hill, which my dad had warned me about, and he said his dad had warned him about. And Charles Harper talks about cyclists dying as they went down it. I wasn't going to die, but it is a fantastic end to the Cotswolds. You come off the Cotswold escarpment and then shoot down towards the Vale of Severn. You can't actually see Gloucester from up there, but you can certainly see beyond it, and you can see the mountains and the hills of Wales. And you've sort of made it into this next chapter, this sort of promised land. So yes, the day 3, which got me from Ensham on the banks of the Thames to Gloucester on the banks of the Severn, was definitely the highlight.
Did you bump into Jeremy Clarkson?
No, but I know exactly what you're talking about. That pub, his pub, was not his pub when I went through, because I did this in the summer of 2023, and I think he's had it. What's it called? The Farmer's Dog, is that right? The pub? And so I went past that, before it was famous, so to speak. So no, I didn't bump into him. But yeah, he would have plenty to say about the A40 these days.
Yeah, and cyclists, I would imagine. But anyway,
yes.
What was it like cycling in the suburbs of London? Because when I lived in Reading, I don't know, perhaps once every year, I would venture down to London on the cycle route, which followed the Thames-ish, and then I always got lost. I was trying to follow the signage, but somewhere around Staines, somewhere like that, I would invariably get lost and just have to kind of make my own route up into the centre. What was it like cycling in the suburbs of, northwest London?
I found London a joy. To my surprise, I think cycling in London gets better and better and better every year. I felt as though I normally had a cycle lane in central London. I then, in the suburbs out towards places like Acton and Hillingdon and Uxbridge, I found that I had an actual bit of curb protecting me between the driver and the cyclists. I took a couple of detours because I always like to take a couple of detours, and they took me along the Grand Union for a couple of stretches, which obviously was its own peaceful little world, and you didn't have to worry then. I did have problems on day one from just north of Uxbridge, between there and Beaconsfield. I did really stupidly get myself on a dual carriageway for a bit, and then have to put up with being on the pavement of the A40 in sort of narrow trunk road mode, and that wasn't very pleasant. That got better once I got to the outskirts of High Wycombe, which itself is actually very good. So yeah, there was a short period where I did feel a little bit uncomfortable. There's a place called Red Hill that wasn't much fun at all, but generally I was able to stay out of trouble in the suburbs and the sort of M25 hinterland, if you like.
So you arrive in Wales, across the Welsh border, you change bikes, you meet your friends. Did those two things coincide? Meeting your friends and changing the bike?
Yes, because they bought the bike. So we all stayed in Monmouth for a couple of nights. The reason we stayed for a couple of nights is that our first day together wasn't actually on the bikes at all. It was in two canoes. So our day 5 is actually sort of partially recreating my bike ride of the previous day and coming down the absolutely gorgeous River Wye for 15 miles. And for me, it was great because it meant I gave the legs a rest, even if my arms ached at the end of the day instead. I think it actually helps give the book a little bit of a different pace as well. But most importantly of all, it's just the right thing to do in that part of the world. The Wye is spectacular. Why wouldn't you want to spend the day on the river just spotting kingfishers flitting here and there? We had a guide. I had hired a chap called Nigel from the canoe organisation there, and he was just a font of advice and knowledge on the river. He'd been canoeing it since he was a lad, and that was just a lovely day to get into this new mood called being in Wales.
Yeah, I remember cycling beside the Wye when I did the Llanlas Cymru, which is that route which goes from Anglesey down to Cardiff, and it is a beautiful valley. I'd never been to that part of the world before, and I was really bowled over by just how nice it was.
Yeah, we went from Kern Bridge back to Monmouth, and that's 15 very undirect miles. The Wye, of course, meanders. It's actually where English tourism was born back in the 18th century. The idea of going out to discover nature and be in these wild places was a bit of an alien concept until that time. So it was also nice to be able to sort of reflect on that and to see what was the same and what was different to what these people were doing in the late 18th century.
Yeah. So I'm assuming Charles Harper didn't take his canoe. So you're about to tell me he did.
No, I'm about to tell you that's the one day where that's the one chapter where Harper doesn't not feature at all. No, I cannot imagine Mr. Harper in a canoe, I have to say. Particularly the Simmons Yacht Rapids that we had to don our helmets for to go down, but survived.
What did you do with the touring bike? Did you have somewhere to leave it and then come back and pick it up?
That just went in the back of Jim's car. Jim got the Bazango off the back of his vehicle. We just shoved my bike in the back of it, left it we'd arranged just on the outskirts of Monmouth somewhere where we could leave a couple of cars, and you're taking a little bit of a risk there, aren't you? But yeah, no problem.
I've if I added up all the days I've spent cycle touring, it's probably, I don't know, I've never really thought about it, but you're probably talking 6 months-ish, something like that. And I think every single day has been by myself. Occasionally you meet somebody or bump into somebody and I'll cycle with them for half an hour. I did it once with a chap in Switzerland, actually, who was called Claude Butler, believe it or not, and he appears in Le Grand Tour. And that was nice for one day, but I'm glad it was just one day. Nothing to do with Claude, very nice chap, everything to do with me, because I just like the idea of making all my own decisions, deciding which road I'm going to go down, where I'm going to stop, where I'm going to sit in a cafe for half an hour and do absolutely nothing. If I'm grumpy, it affects nobody. If I make a mistake and I get lost, there's nobody to have an argument with, because it's just my own fault. And you think, well, okay, I'm lost. I'll go and sort myself out. That's what I do. It must have been, I'm not saying it was difficult, but the contrast for you between the two sections in England and then in Wales, where basically you suddenly had to start taking into consideration what other people wanted. And wasn't that a bit of a challenge, bearing in mind you had to do all this research and you were writing the book and, you had your route to go on? Did you have some kind of unwritten agreement before you set off or before you met these friends as to how it was going to work?
For me, there are many more pros than cons, many more pros than cons. And indeed, I think it was something that I learnt from my Great North Road trip, which was 11 days. And I think actually on about day 6, day 7, I was actually getting a bit lonely in retrospect. On that occasion, I meet up with Dave, one of the 3 lads that makes a reappearance in Go West, on day 9. So I came to realise that I wasn't quite as comfortable in my own company as I thought I would be. So I actually carefully designed this trip so that I would have 50-50. I think 50-50 suits me, and it also suits the storytelling. So whereas Dave just happened to join me on day 9 of 11 in Great North Road just because that was a Saturday and that's when he could get up there, this one I worked out much further in advance. And the 4 of us get on really well, and we've done cycling of many kinds locally and elsewhere in the country before. And I just love the camaraderie of that. And I also find that going up hills is a damn sight easier when there's more of you. I guess we do push each other a bit, although, by the way, we got off the bike sometimes. We're not trying to pretend we stayed on them up every steep hill. So no, the camaraderie and the banter and the sense of teamwork absolutely outweighed any sense that I'd lost, in quotes, lost control, because I think we made quite good decisions together. Nige, one of my friends, he's ex-army and he's kind of like one of those sort of super organised guys. There was one day where he did push us. We were on the Monmouth and Brecon Canal, and we were definitely going at a sort of mile or so an hour quicker than I was comfortable with. And I had sort of told myself much earlier in the journey that I was going to chill and I was going to take it easy. But so a little bit of me was thinking, God, we're really going for it. Can I keep up with this? Is this what I want? But on the other hand, when you're doing 55 miles or whatever it was that day, you do need to have a plan. And I think I may have gone off the rails if I hadn't had other people to help make the correct decisions. For example, I made a very wrong decision just coming down to the Y, where I was thinking I'd take a nice little footpath rather than the proper road. And I ended up in a field surrounded by about 40 cattle who thought that I was going to give them food or whatever they're going to do. And I was actually in a bit of trouble. And I ended up absolutely legging it because they started pouring their feet and stampeding towards me. And I had to use the bike as a sort of protective weapon rather than anything I could actually get on, and then threw myself over some barbed wire fence to get away from them, and then took an hour to find my way out again. There were a couple of other times where we went down these blind alleys, these cul-de-sacs that I should never have selected in the first place. And when there were four of us, we came to the decision, come on, let's just abandon this. Let's go up there. I can tend to be stubborn on my own, whereas if there are four of us, I think the decisions we made collectively were much better. Wisdom of the crowd and all that.
But the practical aspect of knowing that you've got to do the research and you've got to read that notice board or stop and kind of have a wander around whatever building, was that an issue, or were they happy to go along with that? And
they're very happy to do that. Dave fancies himself as a sort of Mickey-taking poet on these trips, so he's always scribbling himself some sort of dodgy rhyming couplet. So he likes to have sort of call a timeout occasionally, as well as me. No, I got. They knew what I was doing. Clearly, they know what I'm doing, and I was given some license to do that. A lot of license, and of course, at the end of the day, when we'd made it, I'd often just disappear for an hour or so, so that I could do what I needed to do, and they'd normally be drinking beer, frankly. I have got fewer notes on those days when we're together in terms of the history, but I like to think that the book has got more sort of dialogue and conversation and that different feel to it as a result. And there are many people, I hope, that will buy my book that do go out in their 2s and their 3s and their 4s and their 5s. And there is a particular kind of chattiness stroke, get on with it vibe about that I really value. And I really value my friendship with Jim, with Nigel, with Dave. And I hope that sort of sense of friendship that we actually put on the back cover of the book in the blurb, actually, enriched with legends, humour and tales of friendship. Go West is a must for anyone who has dreamt of a cycling adventure. And I believe that. I think the book is a lot better for the chat within it. It's something that us blokes of my age don't really talk about very much. And I don't want to go too much further, but it does us all good, right? To get out and just put the world to rights over a few miles and a coffee here and a pint there.
I would imagine I'm not the only person at this point who has got Last of the Summer Wine in the back of their head.
It does get a mention in the book. It does get a mention in the book because there is one point where we're all knackered, injured, and one of the bikes doesn't work, and it just all looks like it's going to pop over Sunday lunch on day 7. But we all, things get rubbed into knees and derailleur gears get fixed, and the idea that we're turning into some kind of Last of the Summer Wine tribute act thankfully recedes.
I won't ask which character you would have kind of identify with. You've brought it back to the book quite rightly, which is, when is it published?
July the 10th.
Right. Now, if we could transport Charles Harper to July the 10th and you gave him a copy and he went off in his miserable way to go and read a copy of your book, what do you think he would think about the book? What would surprise him? What would he like? What would he dislike? And what do you think he'd make of you and your Last of the Summer Wine cronies doing what you did?
I think that he would secretly be pleased, stroke proud, that he was still being quoted more than a century later. But I don't think he'd tell me that at all. I think he'd harumph at occasional bits of bad language that might have slipped in there. Apologies, old boy. I think that he would be slightly bemused by the style and the the dialogue. That's just a question of when you write and what's the accepted mode. But I would really want his approval. I would be gutted if he didn't feel it was within the spirit of what he was doing, for all of his faults. I have a bit in the Cotswolds where I come back onto the A40 and I'm having to be on this major road for just a mile before I get down into the market town called Northleach. And there's a small former pub that he sketched. It's important to say that he was a very good illustrator as well as a writer. And quite often the fun for me was pulling out his book, finding the sketch from, in this case, 1905, and trying to work out what the pub looked like now, or whatever it was. And in this case, it was a private house. And I'm there and I've got the book and I'm trying to line it up, and then I'm trying to take an iPhone picture at the same time. And I know it's stupid, but I feel I can hear him in my head say, "Oh, for God's sake, Silk, it's not like that. It's over here, man." All this sort of stuff. So I do relish in the thought that he's a muse. He's a muse, and he is amused by what's going on, and how I'm sure he would see that he was relevant. And on that front, actually, his illustrations are now seen as so important by historic England that they are collected by that body. Normally, they deal with photos, and they typically want to take pictures of, I don't know, let's say, the outskirts of London before it became a suburb or whatever. But they've made a special exception for Harper because they think that his illustrations in that period before you had the sprawl out from towns and cities really capture a moment in time. So I think that's to get on to fact, what would shock him, what would he be surprised by? I think it's obviously the scale of what we've lost in terms of countryside that would be truly shocking to him. I suppose basically he would recognise things the further away he got from London, wouldn't he? With a few exceptions around the Oxford and the other cities along the way. But no, I would definitely want his approval, I have to say.
It's interesting you talk about the illustrations because I've just looked it up. Episode 60 of this podcast, I interviewed somebody called Tristram Newey, and he is a fan of H.G. Wells's The Wheels of Chance, clearly one of his lesser-known books, but he goes on a cycling journey around the south coast of England, and he followed in the footsteps of the characters in the H.G. Wells book. But there are also illustrations in the book. And again, he did what you did and tried matching up with what exists now. And it was interesting seeing the comparison.
No, I haven't included them. I have wrestled with that as an idea. And I think the trouble with that is that you then want to include the present day, and the present day almost always disappoints. I'm not saying that things are better in the old days. I'm just saying that if you start off with something that he made look pretty back then, the chances are it may not live up to expectations. There are plenty of other places now that would look gorgeous and maybe in retrospect wouldn't have looked so good to him. So I think that before and after trick, which let's face it is done to death, isn't it, in local history booklets, many of which I read and devour, I have to say, and provide inspiration for my own book. But I think that as a tactic, I see as being sort of far too much history leaflet style, whereas whilst I really enjoy weaving in bits of history and geography and topography along the way, I really enjoy that. And I think that's I'd almost go as far as to say that's my USP, really, that I like to really research the history of it without the history taking over. I think that I try to provide that in small, bite-sized chunks at a time that I hope are quite digestible. But I wouldn't want to go too much further down that. By the way, there is plenty of history that I've had to leave out of this book because there's just so much, isn't there? If you're looking for it in the United Kingdom, it is everywhere. And sometimes there were quite impressive stories or legends that I just felt this is going to alter the balance of the book if I include them. So I've had to be quite proportionate in my use of them.
You mentioned he'd written 19 volumes of travelogue. Have you got plans to do another one?
Possibly. I've got another idea in my head at the moment, which is involving the Netherlands. It's not fully formed yet, and I know you know all about that. And this may, if it comes to fruition, it may not be a pure cycling journey. It may be something with a slightly different focus. And I'm still kicking that idea around in my head at the moment. I've had 2 daughters consecutively who've both had a year as students at Leiden University, and it rekindled a love for the country that I've had ever since it was the first place I went to, my first foreign holiday with the family back in the 70s. And for various reasons, we've been back over the years, and I think cycling would be a big part of it, but I don't think it would be a journey from A to B. So that's what I'm kicking around at the moment. But on the other hand, you've got the Great North Road, you've got Go West. There is something about doing a little, the power of 3, isn't there? So I wouldn't rule out something else. Perhaps the London to Norwich, or there's another one that involves going to Cromer, also by Charles Harper. Norfolk is where I live. And the one thing I would say, I would recommend, is if you're wanting to write a journey that goes from London to the furthest part of South Wales, living to the east of Norwich is the worst possible place to start from. So doing something that was slightly more local would save a lot in petrol, apart from anything else.
Yeah, Rob Ainsley, who is the guy who creates the music for this podcast, he did a cycle from Yarmouth to Barmouth.
Yarmouth to Barmouth, nice.
Because they rhymed.
Yeah.
That was his. Did he do it, or did he just propose? He came up with a whole long list of proposals as to places you could visit because they rhymed. And I'm not sure whether he actually did it, but that would be an appropriate place to go from East Anglia, Yarmouth to Barmouth.
I wouldn't be following in Harper's footsteps. That's the thing that's restricting me. If I want to stay with Harper, which I don't have to, but I feel as if I was abandoning the old boy, then I've got to do London. That's also a thing, isn't it? You starting from London does sort of restrict you in some ways.
Yeah, and is there? You've done to the north, you've done to the west. I mean, you mentioned going east-ish. It's more kind of northeast, isn't it? Is there a book in cycling from London to Norwich?
The trouble, of course, is it long enough? You were saying earlier that you would struggle with 8 days. You may have to walk that one, which actually is what Harper did for his shorter journeys. I don't think he would have done it for the Norwich one. I haven't researched that one to know, but I know that his early books, when he was basically on the south coast, walking from, say, London to Portsmouth or Hastings, those were on foot. So that obviously introduces literally a different pace to things. But there were always other ways of doing stuff, aren't there? It was only halfway through my research into Go West that I came up with the idea of, why not get in a canoe? I think with Great North Road, I was sort of felt tied to the road and to doing things, in quotes, properly. And occasionally I sort of beat myself up when I took a detour, even in Gloucestershire. Actually, I abandoned the A40 because I just didn't feel it was on the spur of the moment. And I took another route, and then I sort of beat myself up that I'm abandoning some true path. And then I discovered that there was some ancient Roman road, and I think I'm okay again. And another part of me thinks, for God's sake, Steve, chill out. Do what you want to do. No one's going to pick up this book and say, oh my God, you went wrong on halfway through day 3. That's the great thing, isn't it? We can do what we want. People read it or they don't read it.
Yeah, it is nice when you have those moments of sanity where you realise that actually you don't need to be as pure in whatever respect you're travelling. I had the same issue with the first 3 books. I was very particular about every single metre of the journeys being by bicycle.
Oh yes.
And even in the 3rd book, I'd gone to see a friend on a train, but I made sure I returned on the train to exactly the same spot that I I stopped in order to continue the journey. But the fourth one, the moment when I decided that actually I can't do this unless I take some trains. But that was such a liberating moment, that decision to do that. And also having completed the ride successfully, incorporating those 10 train journeys. And actually, I find it now a lot easier to plan a cycle trip because I'm kind of freed of this thing in my mind which says you've got to do every single meter on the bike. Well, no, I don't. I can do it however I please, and it still works.
Yeah, you will be your own harshest critic, in other words, basically, won't you? And once you give yourself permission, no one else is going to mind. But you still declare that, don't you, in your book? You still very much upfront about that very early on, as I recall.
Yeah, it wasn't. It was a planned decision, but it was. I think there was an element of guilt when I made the decision, but the practical aspect of having to do that in order to complete the journey that I'd set myself in the 2 months that I had available, it was a no-brainer. Otherwise, I wouldn't have completed the journey. So anyway, back to finally, your book. It's out on the 11th of July.
The 10th of July.
Sorry, the 10th of July. It's out on the 10th of July, just in time to inspire people to go off and do their own journeys, hopefully this summer. Have you got any plans to do any cycling this coming summer, 2025?
Well, what I would love to do is to cycle between bookshops back on this route and perhaps do talks along the way. I'm very open if any bookshop owners are listening to your podcast. Nothing would give me greater pleasure just to recapture those moments, really. As you say, being out on the road on a bike in the English-British summer, you just can't beat it.
And if people want to get in contact with you, what's the best way they can do that?
The best way these days is via Instagram or Blue Sky, where I am Steve Silk 66. I have come off Twitter, but I am on those two.
Okay, well, hopefully you will go off and revisit some of these places, and hopefully some of the people will be able to meet you in person. So thank you for talking to me, and good luck with the second book, and good luck with the trip to the Netherlands, and all future cycling, writing endeavours.
And to you, Andrew, thanks so much for inviting me.
So that has been episode 90 of the Cycling Europe podcast. Only 10 to go to the big 100, the big century. Thank you to Steve Silk, and thank you to Gayle Moore for contributing the monologue. I did refer to it as a podcast earlier. I suppose it was a short podcast, but if you want to contribute your own monologue within this podcast, then feel free to do so. All the contact details are on cyclingeurope.org/contact, and as Steve mentioned, his book is out imminently. I think it's the 10th of July, although I'm sure I saw something on social media earlier today which actually said it was the 9th of July. Irrespective, by the time you listen to this, bearing in mind today is Sunday the 6th of July, you're probably going to be able to buy the book in a bookshop. So thank you for contributing, Steve, and I look forward to reading your book from cover to cover. If you'd like to get in contact with the podcast, then I've already given you the contact details, cyclingeurope.org/contact. If you'd like to support the podcast, then you can do that by visiting cyclingeurope.org/support. Thank you to Rob Ainsley, mentioned him earlier in the podcast. I'm always happy to mention him for contributing the theme music to this podcast. And thank you to you for listening. I'll be back with episode 91 at some point in the near future, hopefully, and hopefully you won't have to wait 3 months for the next episode. In the meantime, thank you for listening and happy cycling.